So, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in the brand new WEBVID Podcast studio here in Oval in London. I thought it would be good for us to talk about podcasts in a podcast in our podcast booth.
It's meta. Podcasts in podcasts in podcasts.
It's like meta right the way down to the...
This is the
meta
podcast version of Inception right now.
Anyway, thank you very much for kind of tuning in, whichever platform you're watching this on or listening to this on. I thought it'd be really interesting to talk about a few different things. So what is a podcast? I think we should start with that. It's very easy. A podcast is a piece of audio that is communicated out online, either externally or internally. And podcasts have been around for about 20 years, which is the hilarious thing for me because I have and I know James is going to laugh at this because I say this all the time, a bit of a broadcast background for about, cut to James's face, a bit of a broadcast background working with big networks in the UK and around the world. And we kind of did, we did podcasts early 2000s, probably even back into the late 90s. I think the first piece of audio that was shared online was something like early 90s or mid 90s.
That long?
Yeah. Even for podcasting, like for MP3s and...
But I mean, I suppose the term podcasting wouldn't have been coined then. I feel like
No.
pod came from the whole iPod thing, right?
Yeah, it kind of did. So in about 2003, I was getting really excited with podcasting. So I was based in Leicester Square and everyone thought that podcasting was like the next big audio thing there. So we created lots of podcasts and put them online and no one cared. It was falling on massively deaf ears. And there was a huge reason for that. Yes, there were podcast, I didn't even think about it, Creative Technologies and a few other people that were making podcast players that just weren't very good to use. There weren't places online that were getting the footfall for podcasts. There was no discovery platform really that was working. There was this whole thing about the speed of broadband and data on mobile phones going on back there. So podcasts really weren't taking off, but we in the broadcast industry were really getting excited about how we could potentially use podcasts to go forward. So they're just an audio communication, whether they be comedy, whether they be highlights from a show, whether they be a music podcast.
I mean, it can be anything you want, really.
Absolutely. And I think it was back in 2010, so 10 years ago now, that literally the nail was put in the coffin for podcasts. Everyone was saying there is no way they're going to take off. Podcasting is dead. Wasn't that when you did yours?
That's when I literally started doing my podcast, yeah.
Was it?
Yeah, for about three and a half years, yeah.
And it was just really weird because everyone just kind of forgot about it. Now, there were a couple of podcasters, people like Adam Buxton.
Yeah, it seemed to be, and at that point, you know, in my career as well, it was like, the only people that seem to really still be doing it on a regular basis were people in the comedy sector. Yeah. You know, and that was people that were maybe slightly mainstream. Because you've only, like Ricky Gervais as well, they were doing the stuff off of XFM. But yeah, just people that were on the circuit looking for another platform to tell jokes, do creative ideas.
I mean, Ricky took it to the next level with the animated TV series.
Yeah, which was outstanding.
It was incredible. Yeah. And nobody's ever beaten that when it comes to creative podcasts in a kind of animated or video style. It looks like it's out of sync. Turns out Tammy said that we were out of sync. We're not out of sync, as you can see. No, bad joke. Anyway, we're back. So we were talking about Ricky Gervais and doing the animations and stuff. And actually, I was in Leicester Square when Ricky was on the XFM floor and that was all kicking off. And it was like he was the only one really getting the traction on those sorts of things. Now, you fast forward 10 years.
Yeah.
And here we are talking about podcasts in such a big way. If you haven't thought about a strategy for using podcasts as your marketing or communication channel in 2020, then you're a little bit behind the curve. For the last 3 years, podcasts have been doing some amazing things. And that is because Apple, Spotify, Acast, Luminary, Podbean, have all had their directories just working for them, more people coming online, data on mobile phones being available in unlimited forms. So you stream a podcast rather than downloading a podcast. So
it's that Netflix model, isn't it, really?
Yeah, totally. And the great thing about podcasts that's different over radio, and I think will be the ultimately, I'm not going to say the death of radio, but certainly will cause radio problems. And if broadcasters don't get their position right on podcasts, will miss out. The reason why they're good is because you can choose the content that you want to listen to at any point of the day.
Yep.
And you can mix it up.
Yep.
And that's the great thing about podcasts. So we kind of explained what a podcast is. Physically, it's a sound file which sits somewhere, and then a directory finds that podcast, or you tell it where it is, and it goes out to the world. That means that, and this is quite a common misconception, that people think that Apple and Spotify host or own all of those podcasts that are on their network.
Well, I think that's one of the things when you're entering into the market, you're sort of like, oh, well, I've got to get it on Spotify. Oh, it's got to be on, Apple Podcasts.
Yeah.
Or, a few years ago before they changed it, or iTunes, wasn't it? But
yeah. And I think that, people, we're talking to clients now that don't understand that mechanism. And so basically you have this file, it hosts somewhere on your server on a platform like SoundCloud. Yeah. And then there's a thing called an RSS feed, which is really simple syndication, which basically goes out and tells these podcast directories when you upload a new episode, what that episode artwork looks like, what the description is, what the title is. And then you, from one place, can tell all these different podcast directories about your production.
It's the same mechanism that was used by a lot of blogs and news sites,
Absolutely. It was RSS really was initially set up for text, for news, for seeding with news blogs. So in 2020, some of the stats are just phenomenal. Over 850,000 active podcasts now, over 30 million podcast episodes available on platforms like Apple and Spotify.
That's a big number.
It's huge. And Apple back in 2018, looking at the stats here, said there were about 550,000 podcasts. That's a growth over 300,000 podcasts in 1.5 years. We're looking at other podcast episodes and channels and shows being held behind gateways, premium content that's not given to places like Apple and Spotify. That's Acast and Luminary, who have paid for plans, so they become the Netflix of podcasts. Yep. It's just an incredible landscape out there for podcasts.
But it makes perfect sense though when you start going through those figures. That growth. I mean, partly podcasts are cool again. And they're partly cool again because of that discovery process, and the platforms are giving them the mechanism to be out there. Where the technology is advanced, it's not only accessible on your mobile and all that, but doing it in a studio now, or any kind of outside broadcast scenario, certainly easier than it was 10 years ago, let alone 20 plus years ago.
Yeah.
So all those reasons are that the seeds are in place for something to grow and be really, really successful. And also, I mean, if you look at other content streams over the last, decade, obviously blogging was a really big thing for a time. That market gets very saturated. Then it was like YouTube content. Let's go do YouTube channels. Then that gets really, really saturated. Now you've got your other social media feeds, whether you're on, Instagram or like things, TikTok and stuff. But the early adopters get in, and podcasts has kind of sat there the whole time, slightly untapped. No one was quite sure what to do with it, where it went. And because I think you've got that opportunity to really, have a big market reach, whatever your market is, that makes them very appealing as a piece of content. And whether that's integrated with a social strategy or just supporting anything else that you're doing, and they're quite fun.
But I also think podcasts engage with listeners in a very different way, at a very deep level, because if you're watching this and you do listen to podcasts already, when do you listen to podcasts? In your personal time, when you're probably commuting, when you're in the car and you've got Apple CarPlay on, or the Android version on in your car, or before you go to bed and you've got that on Alexa. These are really personal times that you get to choose that content.
But I wouldn't even strictly say it's just on personal time. I think people can get away with listening to podcasts at work.
You mean that some of our graphic artists in WEBVID listen to podcasts?
No.
They do.
Everybody works really hard. No, but I mean...
Yeah, I agree.
And I think because of that as well, it's the perception, isn't it? There's that kind of culture in office work, whatever your office or shop was, you have a radio station on in the background.
Yeah.
And that'd be kind of acceptable. And then people kind of listen to their own, I'm listening to my MP3 player, whatever. And it evolves on and evolves on. And I think podcasts just fall into that. You can be sat working and be listening to a podcast, and that's kind of acceptable as long as it's not stopping you doing your job. Whereas like if you were sat there watching YouTube videos all day, people would be like, what are you doing? Yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
And I think that we're talking about this being a really great medium for engaging with people, your audience. But it's also a really great medium now to advertise within.
Yeah.
So there's dynamic ad insertion, which if we go back to what we were talking about just a second ago, you have this file hosted somewhere.
Yeah.
And then you have the ability to let companies advertise within your podcast at the start with pre-roll audio, or at the end, or in the middle. And that piece of audio is kind of dynamic. So it's not fixed into that episode. So that means it gives the advertiser the ability to change up in seasons to talk about new stuff that's coming out.
Yeah.
And when advertisers are talking about this, it's such an amazing mechanism because they can reach so many people that love, I don't know, car podcasts or movies or whatever.
Yeah.
So, both ways, it's really good. Actually, and the third way, which is internal podcasts. So people using these for training because it's just a great mechanism to push your message out to your staff. They can all listen. They can listen at their desk. They can be put on the intranet. They can be pushed to their phones. I mean, it's just incredible. Anyway, we kind of explained why podcasts are important in 2020. One of the things that we get a lot of is a client coming to us saying, podcasts, we've heard about them. It's really hot. We need a podcast.
Yeah.
So we're just going to do one now. Let's go.
Yeah, that's the mistake that everyone makes. It's the knee-jerk reaction. It's the we need to do this. I know it's important. Or you're in a position in your company or organization where you do want to try something new. You've got your departmental spend for whatever it is, and it's like, well, what can we do this year? What's going to be the new thing? And you can kind of go straight into it without really giving it strategy. And you really, like, when you put a podcast together, you really need to know what you're doing. And I'm not just talking about in a technical aspect. You need to have a strategy of, how frequent is it going to be? Who's it for? What are we going to be talking about? I mean, it's like, I know we're doing this one-off thing today, but the real, if this was a series, we would have needed to have planned out the year. Yeah. Otherwise you kind of go in and I think that's the thing as well, is whether the medium's kind of like matured. When I was sort of saying earlier on, it was comedians and stuff. They're the kind of people that don't need to necessarily plan it as much, which is probably why in the early days, while it's still going on, because you can kind of turn up and improvise and tell some jokes and it's fine. But I mean, if you're doing it for a communications method or a news method, it needs to have the same level of planning.
Well, there's an old thing in broadcast, which is the best form of spontaneity is pre-planned.
Yeah.
And I think that, if you just go on and you just talk on a podcast about nothing, going all over the place, if you're a person that really knows that subject really well and can do that, then you have that ability anyway as a communicator. But I think you need to really plan this stuff out. And there's so many different podcasts. Yeah. There's business podcasts and comedy podcasts and podcasts that follow TV programs, which are just huge at the moment.
Well, yeah.
You consume these like box sets. There's
a lot of lifestyle stuff,
totally.
Conspiracy theory stuff, music,
true crime.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's endless, really.
Yeah.
But I mean, as I say, going back to your point about clients looking to use it as a mechanism for themselves, it's because it's things that appeal to people outside of work, and that's what you want to be making something that is as good as something that you could consume professionally outside of work.
How long should a podcast be? I'll tell you how long a podcast should be. It should be as long as the content is good.
Yeah.
So it could be a 30-second update on something. It could be 2 minutes. It could be an hour. We'll get on to some of the podcasts we listen to in a second, because I don't want this to go on too long, because I know that your time is really precious. So five things to consider when looking at doing a podcast. So we've kind of touched on it. Commitment.
Yep.
As a brand or a company or as an influencer, the commitment has to be there. It has to be something that you give time to. If you look at people that have done incredible things online, whether it be podcasts or vlogs or whatever, obviously one person that always comes up is Gary V, and Gary Vaynerchuk is his full name. He turned his mum and dad's wine business into a digital wine library online, took it to be a multi-million-pound dollar business. And he did like a set of YouTube vlogs that took years to get any traction at all. So you have to have that commitment. I'm not going to say it's going to take you 2 years to get any listeners. It could happen with the right marketing plan behind it within weeks or months, but you have to have that commitment to go forward. Frequency is incredibly important. You have to, before you go forward, know how much content you're going to put out, how frequent it's going to be. If you do a season of something, so if you're doing a true crime podcast and it's a season, that's fine. As long as you know how many's in the season comes out and you know you're going to follow that up with another season, and that's going to be there, and that's going to be in, 10 parts or whatever.
I mean, that's perfectly okay. That's what Netflix do. They drop a whole series. There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what you can do. Or you can take that 10 episodes and you can drop them every week. You don't have to be there at the same time.
Which is the TV model.
Of course. But if you do something where you go, I'm going to make 3 episodes and kind of see how it goes.
Yeah, or
it doesn't work out.
Yeah, or even if you start a series and then, you're finishing an episode and we'll be back next time.
Yeah.
I mean, when's
that?
Yeah, you need to know that stuff so that you can engage with your audience. I mean, it's all well and good that the platforms give you, the opportunity to subscribe, so you'll get notifications when content comes out. People kind of forget and don't care. If they really invested in what you've got to say, they want to know when it's going to be out again, when they can listen to more. So
weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, you've got to set that frequency out. Quality. I'm a big advocate of the podcast for brands need to sound good. And hopefully you're listening to this going, wow, that podcast sounds pretty good.
Although this mic's popping a bit because I haven't got a pop shield on.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
But that's because we're in a brand new podcast studio here in London in our HQ. We've invested a lot of money in this. We've got multiple cameras set up. We've got a vision mixer outside Tammy, who I would ask to wave, but you wouldn't see her right now.
For those of you that can't see, she's waving.
Kind of, yeah. This is a brilliant opportunity for you to come down and create something of quality. A post-production house in central London is going to set you back a lot of money. Doing it at home isn't really the best thing. Quality needs to be upkept. Saying that, though, it is quality of content that will shine through. Yeah. And again, going back to the planning of that, has to be planned. So the quality of content is king. We've heard this before. It's an old cliche, but it is true. You have to have great content. Yeah. When we talk about our favorite episodes, just to round off in a second, one of mine has amazing content, but is recorded really badly. Yeah. I'm just kind of thinking how much better that would be if it was recorded in such a better way. Anyway, we'll get onto that in a second. Yeah. Marketing, you've got to think about that. How are you going to do it socially? Paid ads. You've got to get it out there. You have to tell people where your podcast is, or nobody is going to listen. And then conversation. You need to talk to your audience when that podcast is out. You've got to comment on threads. You've got to maybe take some of their questions and put into a podcast to make it Q&A, make them feel part of it. And it's really important. So they're like the 5 big takeaways: commitment, frequency, quality, marketing, and conversation for me. So let's round off because it's been quite a long time. Thank you for persevering. Your favorite podcasts?
I've really enjoyed last year. I sort of binge listened to all the series of the Deliciously Ella podcasts. Mm-hmm. Not sort of a story I'd followed massively, although, that her and her husband sort of developed a lot of healthy foods, which is sort of linked to Ella's sort of personal lifestyle changes. But the podcast series follows a lot of health and welfare kind of issues, and that can be diet, mental health, all sorts of things like that. And it's just really interesting discussion. It's discussion that I'm interested in personally. The way the podcast is produced, it's just quite calm and relaxing, nice to have on while you're cooking or just like chilling out. But it's informative, So, I mean, it appeals to me. And again, it's not the kind of content that I think without podcasting would really be able to cut through.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't think that would make more than maybe, a half an hour special on a radio station once.
Yeah.
But it's fantastic. It's a really great series. And I mean, there's some smaller, like more independent podcasts I like. There's The Corner Table, which actually a friend of mine presents that. But, he goes around and interviews people that have released books, and they eat at a restaurant and talk about the book over dinner. And as I say, the production on that from the first episode to now has improved massively. But again, it's just interesting conversations with people.
Yeah.
And that's what it's a bit like, I suppose, the equivalent of being a fly on the wall. You're just listening into those kinds of conversations. Very interesting. And I've listened to The Complete Guide to Everything, which has been going for about 11 years or more. Two American guys.
So they were back there doing it nice and early, thinking no one's listening, and all of a sudden now they're
they
huge.
did the podcast live thing before that became cool again now.
Well, maybe we should talk about the podcast live thing in another episode.
Yeah, sure.
One of the podcasts that I listen to all the time, I'm a massive boxing fan.
You are.
Which means that I love consuming Radio 5 Live's Costello and Bunce, and I love Pound for Pound. That one there from Spencer Oliver and Jake Wood could be produced better, but it's a fantastic podcast with the content that I want to listen to, and so I make a beeline for that every week. Oh, and one more I want to talk about quickly is The Unexplained, which conspiracy theories, kind of paranormal, that sort of stuff. It's Howard Hughes, who was a former news broadcaster on Capital Radio many years ago, and he's been doing that for years. It's a great sounding podcast. He gets thousands of listeners all over the world, and I just love listening to it late at night. It's a bit scary, a bit spooky, and I stick that on my Echo and have a listen. So it's really interesting. Podcast is a fantastic space, and if you're watching this and thinking you want to find out a little bit more about how podcasting can help your brand, then get in touch with us at WEBVID. You can get in touch with me at neil.bentley@webvid.com or
james.mabbott@webvid.com, or add us on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Sorry, what were you doing there with your hands?
You can add us on LinkedIn.
Okay, interesting. Thanks ever so much for watching.